Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Ryan Tierney, and I'm a student at Harvard College. This past week, while many of us have been preparing for midterm exams, Washington has been a busy place. Between the debt ceiling, a looming government shutdown, and an impasse on President Biden's signature infrastructure deal, things are constantly evolving and, frankly, becoming more confusing. Today, we're honored to be joined by a panel who can help us understand the situation. Ms. Ashley Allison is the former National Coalition Director for the Biden-Harris campaign and one of our IOP resident Fall Fellows. Mr. Jason Furman is a Harvard Kennedy School professor and a former chief economist for President Obama. Mr. Michael Strain is the American Enterprise Institute Director of Economic Policy Studies. And finally, our panel will be moderated by Ms. Margaret Talev, the Axios Managing Editor for Politics. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy today's discussion.
Awesome. I think that's my cue. Thanks to everyone for joining us. And since our time is so short, I want to get right to it, but we will, of course, as Ryan said, save some time at the second half of this conversation for student and audience questions. So with that, let me just set things up and then we'll go. We have averted a shutdown. Congress averted a shutdown. The debt limit is weeks away, so we don't have to worry about that. That's taken care of. And it does look like Democrats are at least closer than they were yesterday or the day before to some kind of agreement that could allow for a final vote on that bipartisan infrastructure deal and some version of a massive social spending package, build back better, as Jason would say. But less than $3.5 trillion. So I think that kind of frames where we are at this moment with President Biden on the Hill trying to charm and twist arms and everyone trying to figure out how to message this and come to a final resolution. Let's start at kind of a 50,000 foot level if we can, because assuming all of this happens, it's going to be even in a dialed back format, a massive infusion of cash, job creation, and programmatic creation into the economy. And that has impacts up and downstream. So Jason, let me start with you. We all follow your tweets and your charts religiously. What does the data so far tell you about whether all of this is actually going to drive inflation and whether that's temporary or permanent?
Yeah, so Margaret, there's two ways to think about when the government spends money. One is that it's fiscal stimulus, it's strengthening the demand side of the economy, and you do that when you have a high unemployment rate. That's what was intended by the legislation in March. That legislation overshot the mark and was bigger than it needed to be, but that's a whole different debate. What they're debating now is really focused on the medium and long term. And it's focused on the supply side of the economy. It's less, I think, regardless of how they talk about it, about creating jobs and more about making better jobs. For example, if you have more infrastructure, also enabling more people to work. For example, if you have more preschool, more parents, especially mothers, are able to enter the labor force. And so I think of this as not a short-term infusion of cash into the economy, in a fiscal stimulus sense, but all about expanding the possibilities over time. I think some of the elements in it do that quite well. Others probably a bit more mixed.
Temporary versus permanent, is that I mean, I know you're talking about short-term versus long-term, but in terms of the impacts, like, will there be inflation as a matter of course, if there's, let's say, 1.2 trillion and somewhere like 2.1 trillion, if that combined number is somewhere north of 3 trillion, is that an inflationary trigger? And is it lasting or short-term, or you don't buy that it's inflationary?
Yeah, I don't think inflation should be an important part of the debate over this, because it's mostly going to be paid for, the timing and the gimmicks and whatever else, but I think it'll still be mostly paid for. It spends out over a long period of time. Some of it increases the supply side of the economy. The Fed can offset it if it wants. So I think there's good arguments against it. We'll hear the best version of the arguments against it from Michael. I still won't be persuaded, but there'll be the best versions of that argument. There's good arguments for it that I think carry the day, but I don't think whether it will raise or lower inflation over the next 5 to 10 years is an important consideration. I think the effects there are quite small.
Okay, so you sort of led me to the natural transition then. Michael, why don't you pick it up from here and then we'll go to Ashley. But how do you read the economic impact and implications if this realm of spending passes that we're pretty close to at this moment.
I don't think Jason should be closed-minded about my ability to get him to change his mind. I think by the end of this, he'll be firmly agree with me. I think it's important to separate the two packages. I think that everything Jason said is certainly true of the bipartisan infrastructure program. That program would not spend a lot of money in 2022. It would spend most of its money between 2023 and 7 years after that. It is really designed to make the supply side of the economy more productive, but making it easier for businesses to do business by improving roads and bridges and ports, make it easier for people to participate in the economy by expanding broadband access. It even, I think, would help the economy over a 50-year time horizon by cleaning up lead in the nation's drinking water supply and things of this nature. So if anything,
so I think, by the way, Margaret, I think that was perfect. I think you should go to Ashley now.
So if anything, I think the impact of that bill, of the infrastructure bill, would be to reduce inflationary pressures, not exacerbate them. When I look at the $3.5 trillion bill, I think there's a lot to what Jason says. I think that there are programs in there that are designed, for example, to increase workforce participation, which would put downward pressure on prices throughout the economy and help economic growth. But a whole lot of the spending the president wants to do is really consumption spending, not investment spending. A whole lot of the spending the president wants to do is to put cash in people's pockets. Of the $3.5 trillion, about $0.5 trillion of that is an expanded child tax credit, which is just, again, putting money in people's pockets. That will increase the demand side of the economy and put upward pressure on prices. If you look at the way that it's likely to be structured, the tax increases are going to kick in later than the spending kicks in. And so if you think that we're going to have inflationary pressure in 2022 that could last into 2023, the fact that a lot of the spending would be offset by higher taxes, and the fact that some of the spending would do things like increase workforce participation, doesn't really address the concern about the macroeconomic environment in the year 2022. And I think this would increase some of the problems that we have in the overall economy next year.
Okay, Michael, I'm going to come back to you in a second because you said something deliciously counterintuitive about.
I've convinced you.
I think we'll talk about deflation in a minute. And I'm also, we should probably get to the debt ceiling before we go to Q&A. But Ashley, let me turn to you now. If the $3.5 trillion number has to come down on the reconciliation package in order for there to be an agreement, how should it happen? And by the way, feel free to take a crack at the inflation stuff also if you want to. But when I think about that number, $3.5 trillion, a big part of the discussions this week have been, what's the magic number? What will Manchin go along with? What's Sinema's secret number? What will the progressives, live with? So if you have a thought on what the number is, it looks like it's probably around 2 trillion, maybe a little bit more. But how should it happen? Should it be trims across the board? Should you just keep some projects in terms of how they are totally conceived and jettison others, like, I don't know, free community college or something? What spending is the most impactful socially and the most impactful politically?
So, I want to think about this just in the broader conversation. There's been a lot of conversations about infighting within the Democratic Party. I think what is happening right now is very healthy for our democracy first, that there is a party that is willing to have rigorous discourse about how they should be serving the American people rather than a party who will just fall in line and do whatever the leader at the top says. So I actually appreciate what is happening right now. In regards to how the numbers should be developed, I don't think that you should just do a massive cut to one program and say, oh, we'll get to it later. We know how politics is. Later could be, in 100 years, perhaps. the way the Washington moves. I do think we have a number, 1.5 trillion. I don't think that can be the last number. I think if progressives want to counter that with another number that is not 3.5 trillion, that's okay. I don't think they should go, okay, we have a deal, maybe come down to the upper 2.7, 2.8, and have a true, honest negotiation so that if you go from 3.5 trillion to 1.5 trillion, which is the Manchin number, so much is going to get cut. And I ultimately think it will hurt the American people. People knew that the Biden plan in 2020 was going to focus on community college, focus on the caregiving economy, focus on infrastructure, but in a broader definition. And they turned out and they supported him. So I think what is happening is healthy, but I also think there needs to be a healthy negotiation where we now have 1.5 trillion, let the progressives come back with another number that is still higher than that. And hopefully by the end of the day, we can have a resolution, but not cut massive programs across the board in this package.
Okay, so Ashley's advocating for keeping everything, even if it needs to be tweaked, or most everything, even if it needs to be tweaked a bit. Curious, Michael and Jason, from your perspectives, take either argument that you want to, either in terms of political benefit to the Democrats or in terms of social benefit to big chunks of America. What are the most important programs to preserve? And let's leave the infrastructure package aside, since since everyone on this panel, all three of you agree that that one's okay. Let's tackle the one that is a little more controversial.
I don't really see much to like in the $3.5 trillion package, and I know Jason will agree with me on that. I think that there are some good goals there. I support the goal, for example, of making childcare more affordable and expanding access to quality childcare. I don't think an open-ended subsidy for commercial daycare is the right way to approach that. I think that'll just boost the price of childcare, make it harder for some people to get. Doesn't really do anything for people who work evenings and weekends, who rely on family networks for childcare, things of this nature. I think it is a good goal to fight child poverty by expanding the child tax credit and by making the child tax credit fully refundable. I don't think it makes sense to make the child tax credit more generous for households who are earning six-figure incomes. So I think, from my perspective, there are definitely some good goals here, but the process of putting this legislation together has been so rushed, and there has been really no substantial debate over the details of any of these proposals, that I think a lot of them would move the country in the wrong direction, even if they have the right goal. So I would encourage the Democrats to think about, what they actually want to do, and then to take the time to have a process to figure out the best way to do that. It probably still wouldn't end up where I would ideally do it if I were king, but I think it would be that process would end up producing better policy.
That sounds like means testing in that context is something you would be in favor of.
Well, reverse means testing in the case of the child credit, having it available to households who have very low or no earnings, and not having it available to the middle class.
Jason.
Yeah, so first of all, just from an economic perspective, I think we can afford to do a decent amount. I am completely fine with the 3.5 trillion number. I'm fine even with a higher number. Pay for most of that. I think you can afford, if some of it's well-targeted investments, to add it to the debt. So I don't, for me, this isn't about the economics of the number. If you told me, Jason, you only have blank amount of money to spend, you only have 1.5 trillion, you only have 2 trillion, and your menu is roughly the menu that was set out there, I would say, first of all, it's better to do some things well than a lot of things badly. I don't like the idea of having programs that expire in a couple of years. It's hard to build them. It's hard to make them predictable. And frankly, you've seen this with tax cuts passed by President Bush. They mostly got extended. I don't know that all of this is so popular that if Republicans were in charge of Congress or Republicans had the presidency, that they'd continue it. So I'd hate to see 2 years of a wonderful thing and then it going away. I'd rather pick the most wonderful things and do the best you can to make them last forever. In terms of the most wonderful things, I would focus on climate change and children as my two organizing principles. I think those are the highest return investments there, either in terms of greater equity and opportunity, in terms of future economic growth, or in terms of serving another important purpose, which is addressing climate change. So I'd focus on those and say a lot of the others, it's a shame. We'd love to get around them. We're going to propose them in our next budget. We're going to continue to fight for them, but we couldn't fit everything. And if you can't fit everything, those would be my top two.
And sorry, go ahead, Ashley.
So I feel like in DC, we live in an extreme scarcity mindset that if we have to just do a little bit. And I think people heard a policy presentation over the course of a very long primary and a very long general election and made a choice. And it seemed like they made the choice that they wanted to fix the economy. They wanted to create access, not just to the middle class, but to upper middle class, moving people out of poverty. And that is what the Build Back Better plan does. And it doesn't do it for some, it does it for the majority of Americans, for brown people, for Black people, for poor people. It creates pathways that haven't been created before. And so to tell someone who perhaps sacrificed or risked their life to vote in the middle of a pandemic because they believed they were electing Democrats that maybe will do it next time, that is why I think government doesn't work. And that is why I think the electorate sometimes is so frustrated with DC, is because we always tell them to wait. What if we shifted our perspective and said, now is the time, let's do it all well, because we are America, we are the greatest country and we can do it well, rather than telling people, and typically the same type of people over and over, it's not your turn, you need to wait. And I think if you were to tell folks, we are gonna stand, we are gonna deliver for what, you won't have to worry about Republicans getting back in power, because those voters will come out and vote for you again. And so you can extend those programs.
Okay, you've taken me to a place where I want to go with 2 minutes left before we turn to Q&A, which is just the politics of this. I don't know, show of hands, or we can go quickly through, but to each of you, do you feel that that passing the $1.2 trillion deal and whatever the bigger deal is will help the Democrats heading into the midterms?
I confess I have no idea. And often these things have different popularity after they're passed than before they're passed. I've seen things that poll well when you propose them and then they happen and they're not, and vice versa. So I hate to,
you don't know. Michael, do you think it will help Democrats, or the flip side, do you think it would hurt Democrats not to be able to get anything done?
I think if they get nothing done, that would not be the best position going into the midterms. But I think the question is, if they get the infrastructure package and nothing, is that worse than the infrastructure package and 1.5 trillion? Is the infrastructure package and 1.5 trillion worse than the infrastructure package and 3.5 trillion? There, I don't know.
Okay, two don't knows. And Ashley, help Democrats or not help Democrats to get it done?
They have to get something done.
Okay, help them if they get it done.
I didn't hear you.
Yes, you said helps Democrats.
It helps them if they get it done. If we are a country of compromise, so yes, compromise, but they have to get something done.
I think about the Affordable Care Act. Let's even go back in time a little bit. Social Security, Medicare. These are, whether you're technically entitlements or not, these are things that Americans think of as effectively entitlements, things that are a guarantee that government helps provide for you in life. When you look at the menu of stuff that is on the cusp of maybe passing in the next couple days or a month, which is kind of the New Deal Social Security lasting thing that no one ever takes away, that changes American society, that Americans say, yeah, I get this because I'm an American. What is that piece?
I don't think anything rises to that level that's being proposed. The kind of basic bones of what the president wants to do is to build on pre-existing programs, which isn't really New Deal-esque. And there are some new things he wants to do. A couple more years of universal preschool, a paid family leave program, that would be new programs, but I don't think it would be anything on the scale of what President Roosevelt did, or what even what President Johnson did. The one exception to that, I think, could be the child allowance, giving whatever it is, 98% of households with kids, or something like that, the overwhelming majority of households with kids, giving them a monthly income rather than giving them a tax credit that is assessed as part of their overall tax liability at tax time. Instead of that, giving them a monthly income that just drops in their checking account every month. That could be the kind of program that is looked back upon as having changed the relationship between the citizen and the state in the way that the Social Security program did, or the food stamp program did. But I think it's unclear as to whether that would have that effect.
Real quick before we go to questions, Ashley, Jason, any thoughts on the most lasting piece of this?
Look, I think there's an intense polarization now. So I think anything that happens here 3 years from now, Republicans are going to hate. If you ask 5, 10, 15 years from now, the idea of universal preschool, which would be funded by this, is really hard for me to imagine. I mean, imagine someone coming along now and saying, hey, the government shouldn't pay for first grade. There's no reason for us to have first grade. If people like first grade, they can pay for it. The idea that you'd say that about preschool is hard for me to imagine, but I think we need to get past the initial polarization response that will be the first wave.
Ashley, any thoughts about the most lasting legacy?
This is hard, but I think the way you handle the caregiving economy, that could be revolutionary, particularly coming up, hopefully at one point out of this pandemic, and we all hopefully get the opportunity to age, and we need people to take care of us. So I think that could be pretty lasting.
Awesome. Okay, I've eaten into 3 minutes of question time, so I'm going to go there, but I hope that one of the people who hasn't asked a question yet will ask you guys, who will be the next Fed chair? All right, Luke, no pressure, but our first question goes to Luke Albert from the college. Take it away.
Hi all, and thanks for letting me ask a question. Thanks for joining us today. Just a question more regarding the spending debates that are happening, especially in terms of discretionary spending. The government is avoiding a shutdown, and a CR was passed, and just over a week ago, another NDAA, so a defense budget, was passed with another increase. My question is, why do you think increases in defense spending in terms of discretionary government spending continue to be framed in different ways than efforts to expand social spending, particularly when the numbers of the latter are so dwarfed by the former?
Who wants to grab that?
Luke, thanks for that question. I certainly think the most important thing is that they go through and make choices. This area of the budget should go down, that area of the budget should go up. Here's what it should be for an entire year, instead of what was done, which is basically autopilot, take everything and just extend it for 2 months. I know I ran one of the smallest agencies in the government, 35 people, and it was hard for me to run that when I didn't know what my budget was going to be, 1-2 months ahead. In terms of defense, I frankly haven't studied and understood the defense budget well enough to have an opinion about whether it should go up or down. I think in the non-defense budget, there's an awful lot that should go up. I think there are certainly some things that should go down. On net, I think there's room to raise it, and it should be raised. That's what President Biden has proposed.
Okay, we've got our next question is from Alex Chan. Alex, the floor is yours.
Well, hi everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. My question is kind of a little bit more like for President Biden personally. What is the consequence for him if all this polarization within the Democratic Party stops, prevents him from passing anything? What will that mean for his presidency going forward?
I can take that. I just want to offer, I don't think there is polarization in the Democratic Party. I think that there are people with different views that are having an intellectual conversation about where they want to see the country. So that's the first thing. I think it will hurt. I think if we don't get anything done, but beyond 2024 and 2022, with redistricting in play and all of the electoral races that will be going on, I think it will be extremely hard for Democrats to hold the Senate and the House. We know there are slim margins, but I do actually think that if we have a strong progressive agenda that is delivered, we could potentially hold both or expand our margins in some places and win some governor seats as well, and ideally secure for 2024. But I think if you have a stalled Congress because you don't, after the 2022 midterm election, the next 2 years of the Biden presidency is going to be pretty challenging.
Thank you, Alex. Before we wrap up, and as we're waiting for the next question, I'm going to go back to my question. Who's next Fed chair going to be? Is it going to be Jay Powell, or is Lael going to make a big splash? What's going to happen? What's everyone betting, and why does it matter?
Since leaving government, I try to speak in a frank and honest manner. But you just asked me about two friends of mine who together, I think, have done a terrific job running the Fed. So I'll evade your question. Michael knows the answer, I'm sure. And Ashley, maybe Ashley is the next Fed chair.
I've also tried to avoid this question and have succeeded in doing so until this moment. I think the smart money is probably on Chairman Powell, but I think it's far from a done deal.
Does it matter? I mean, we're talking about President Biden has been pretty clear about what his social policy is, how he's approaching the economy. Pandemic obviously is driving the bus on a lot of this stuff, and if anywhere from $3 to $5 trillion in spending over the next 10 years gets added, a lot is going to be set in motion. Does it matter who the next Fed chairman is?
I think it matters more than any one other individual in the government. There's no one else who can make choices, including the president, like a Fed chair can make that can affect the economy. Is there a difference between the different people being named and what they would do and what the impact would be? I think that's a question, one could have a bigger debate around.
So let's close it out with the debt ceiling, that pesky little thing that has to happen to avoid an actual crisis rather than the drama of a pretend crisis that's not really a crisis. That would be a crisis. There's been a lot of discussion about the Republican strategy of saying, you know what, Democrats should just do this alone. They're the ones who want to do all the spending anyway, do it through reconciliation. From each of you, is there any alternative other than Democrats doing it on their own? And does it really matter? Is that just going to be the way we do things now going forward?
I hope not.
Well, I think.
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I think Democrats certainly should not have to do it alone. The debt is a function of the fact that federal spending outpaces federal revenue. Both parties are responsible for the gap between spending and revenue. Raising the debt ceiling should be a completely routine, totally mundane, unnoticed, bipartisan act. And I think the Republicans are failing to meet a basic function of responsible governance by playing political games with the debt ceiling. I think they stand to harm the economy by doing so, even if they run up to the brink and the debt ceiling is still raised. That could end up harming the economy in ways small and potentially large. They seem pretty committed to not doing anything to help. There are some questions about whether or not the Democrats are going to be able to do it on their own. I think if push comes to shove and Democrats actually aren't able to do it on their own, then the Senate will produce 10 Republicans who choose not to filibuster the bill, which would allow it to pass with a majority vote. So that could happen, but I think it would require convincing Republicans that that we were going to default within like the next hour or so, and there was really not a whole lot that could be done to stop that without a tiny bit of cooperation on their part and by not filibustering.
I just find it highly problematic that anyone could knowingly lead a country into a financial crisis or any crisis and just say like, I'm not going to do it, even though that's my job. Like that.
Well, they don't think they are doing that. I mean, they think they don't think there will be a financial crisis or any financial harm. So I think if they change their mind on that, then I think they will find those 10 votes. But it will take being very close to the brink for them to change their mind on that.
I don't know if I agree with that, but I just think we're in a place where we're arguing about a party, whether or not they should help people. And then there's a party that just throws their hands up and says, we're going to just be a total obstructionist.
Democrats have toyed with the threat of not raising the debt ceiling before also. Jason, do you have any thoughts you want to share now, or do you want to just wait till 3 weeks from now and do this all again?
I agree with Michael. The Republicans should vote to raise the debt limit. I said exactly the same thing in 2017 to the Democrats when Trump was president. I think we should get rid of the debt ceiling entirely or raise it by $1 Google, which is 1 with 100 zeros, and then come back shortly before the heat death of the earth to return to the issue. But most importantly, it needs to get done. It absolutely needs to get done.
Okay,
on
guys.
The flip side, if Jason gets his way with this inflationary spending, we could reach that 1 Google well before the heat death of the earth.
Or the earth could just melt next week and put us all out of our misery. Everyone, on that note, on this Friday at 4:30 in the afternoon Eastern time, I would like to thank Ashley Allison, Michael Strain, and Jason Furman for all of your time and thoughts after a very, very interesting and impactful economic week on Capitol Hill. And Ryan, I turn this back to you, and thanks to all of you for joining us today.